The crowds gathered, and a willful American public cheered along the packed street vendors and political pomps surrounding the presidential inauguration along Pennsylvania Avenue that day on March 4th of 1869. Crowds did not see a polished politician. No, and neither did they see a career businessman with a financial potential for gain rolling down the street that day. Instead, what they did see was a general who had just accepted Robert E. Lee's terms of surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. They saw the general who had preserved the Union and secured the peace from a brutal civil war. They also saw stability after the turbulent presidency of Andrew Johnson, politically shamed vice president of Abraham Lincoln, who had been thrust into the office by accident after Lincoln's assassination. You see, Grant himself felt the weight of unfinished and rather questionable work left by his predecessor. The war was over, but Reconstruction, at least to the standard of the Republican ideals, who now controlled the vast majority of all federal power, had only begun. So Ulysses S. Grant entered the office of the presidency, determined to protect the results of his and the rest of the men of the Union who fought brutally for a victory. You see, the 13th and the 14th Amendments had abolished slavery and then redefined what American citizenship means to include everyone, not just the wealthy and the white. But Southern resistance to a newly reconstructed Union was fierce and still determined to succeed. Seeing an unprecedented crime wave across both the South and the West of ex-Confederates and Loyalists robbing Union trains, cattle, and banks in an attempt to raise funds for a new effort for war, and even white supremacist violence threatened to overturn the fragile gains of freedom now in the hands of many black Americans. Violence that President Johnson failed to even initiate or resolve. In his inaugural address, Grant pledged support for the 15th Amendment of the United States Constitution, granting black men the right to vote. You see, he and the rest of the Republican Party believed this amendment was essential to secure liberty for all. And unlike many of the politicians at the time, Grant spoke simply. He valued order, duty, and loyalty. But he was entering a political battlefield that required subtle maneuvering, something that did not come naturally to the career soldier. So Grant chose his cabinet based largely on trust of those privy to the DC game, not realizing though that the DC swamp was as treacherous and deep as it is today. His most successful appointment was Hamilton Fish, whose state diplomacy would define the administration's foreign policy. At the Treasury, George S. Boutwell focused on reducing the massive Civil War debt. Grant supported repayment and gold to restore national credit. In 1870, Grant signed legislation creating the United States Department of Justice. He appointed Amos T. Ackerman, who would aggressively prosecute white supremacist violence. Grant also appointed Eli S. Parker, a Seneca native and former military aide, as Commissioner of Indian Affairs. It was a symbolic and historic appointment, but Grant's defining early decision would not concern finances or foreign policy. It would concern civil rights actions. In 1870, the Ku Klux Klan had spread a terror across the South. Black voters were often intimidated into suppression by acts of terror, such as being whipped, beaten, and even murdered. Republican officials were even targeted by them. Republican-led Reconstruction governments were under siege, and Congress passed the enforcement acts, including the Ku Klux Klan Act, granting the president extraordinary powers to fight them. President Grant did not hesitate. In South Carolina, he suspended habeas corpus. Federal troops arrested hundreds of Klansmen. The Justice Department secured thousands of indictments. For a time, the Klan collapsed. Black voter turnout soared. The federal government had, for perhaps the first time, intervened decisively to protect civil rights. It was one of the most significant uses of executive power in defense of equality in American history. While violence and post-war collapse smoldered at home, tensions with Great Britain threatened abroad. You see, the British, who had built a large amount of Confederate naval ships, including the Alabama and the CSS Shenandoah, which, shameless plug here, I did a video on previously, you should check it out, it's pretty freaking awesome, had caused significant damage during the Civil War. Under Hamilton Fish's guidance, the United States negotiated the Treaty of Washington in 1871. The dispute was submitted to international arbitration, and Britain agreed to pay $15.5 million in gold. The peaceful resolution strengthened American credibility amongst the world powers and avoided a potential war with Great Britain. It was a triumph of diplomacy. Seriously, you should check out the video on the CSS Shenandoah. This dude from South Carolina gets a naval boat from England, gets a bunch of British stowaways from Australia, goes over to the Bering Sea and starts clapping all sorts of Union whaling vessels and winds up stopping the whaling industry in the area for America. I mean, say which one about the Confederates and all that, but in the end, they helped save the whales. So, I mean, potato, potato, I guess. Believed that American expansion could serve moral as well as strategic goals. He sought annexation of Santo Domingo, which is now called the Dominican Republic, hoping it might provide opportunity for freed slaves. You see, Haiti, Jamaica, and other island nations around the Caribbean had become safe havens for many freed slaves, not to mention its strategic advantage. The proposal split Republicans. Senator Charles Sumner opposed the treaty. The Senate rejected it. Grant felt betrayed, his political relationships frayed. The episode revealed his sensitivity to opposition and his difficulty navigating Senate politics. In 1872, Grant signed legislation creating Yellowstone National Park, preserving vast lands for public enjoyment. It was a visionary act of conservation. He also attempted civil service reform, establishing a commission to introduce merit-based appointments. Congress, however, refused to fund it long-term. Then, scandal struck. Financiers Jay Gould and James Fisk attempted to corner the gold market in 1869. When Grant discovered the scheme, he ordered Treasury gold sales, crashing the market on what became known as Black Friday. Though he acted to stop manipulation, his association with the speculators damaged his reputation. In 1872, he won re-election by a landslide. His first term had been bold and energetic, marked by civil rights enforcement and diplomatic success. But shadows were now gathering. Months into his second term, economic disaster struck. Railroad speculation collapsed, banks failed, and the stock exchange closed. The Panic of 1873 triggered a prolonged depression. Unemployment rose sharply, businesses failed, public confidence wavered. Grant resisted inflationary demands. He voted a bill to expand paper currency and instead signed the Resumption Act of 1875, committing the nation to return to gold payments. To some, he appeared steadfast. To others, he seemed indifferent to suffering. Violence again surged in the South. In Louisiana, over 100 black men were murdered in the Colfax Massacre. In Arkansas, rival Republican factions fought in the Brooks-Baxter War. Paramilitary groups, such as the White League and the Red Shirts, openly intimidated voters. The President Grant sent troops when they requested. He restored Republican governments, but Northern support for Reconstruction was fading, especially amid economic hardship. You see, the Supreme Court narrowed federal enforcement of powers. Southern Democrats regained control of state governments one by one. Grant had fought hard to preserve black citizenship, but the political tide was turning against him. Grant's peace policy towards Native Americans, overseen initially by Eli Parker, aimed to reduce corruption and conflict. Yet, expansion pressure intensified. Wars erupted across the West. In 1876, General George Custer was killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn, a Civil War hero of the Union Army. Public outrage demanded stronger military action. Native tribes were eventually forced onto reservations, and the Black Hills were seized. Grant's hope for humane reform collided with the relentless push of westward expansion. Scandals deepened during President Grant's second term. The whiskey ring, uncovered in 1875, revealed widespread tax evasion involving distillers and federal officials. Over 100 convictions followed. Grant's private secretary, Orville Babcock, was indicted. Grant testified in his defense. Though Babcock was acquitted, the president's loyalty reinforced perceptions of corruption. Secretary of War William W. Belknap resigned under impeachment threat for accepting bribes. Grant himself was never personally implicated in wrongdoing, but his trust and friends repeatedly harmed his administration. As President Grant prepared to leave office in 1876, the election plunged the nation into crisis. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes faced Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. Disputed electoral votes in several southern states threatened chaos. Grant remained neutral, but ensured order in Washington. And the Electoral Commission awarded the presidency to Hayes. In the political compromise that followed, federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction, at least as a militarily enforced objective, ended. The rights Grant had fought to defend were left increasingly unprotected, especially now that many former Confederate soldiers were now becoming politicians in the South. term had been energetic and forceful, defined by civil rights enforcement, diplomatic success, and reform efforts. His second term, however, was burdened by economic depression, violent resistance to Reconstruction efforts, and relentless scandal. Yet, history's judgment has grown a bit more nuanced. Grant used federal power to protect black citizenship when many would not. He avoided foreign war, he preserved national credit, and he established enduring institutions, including the Department of Justice and Yellowstone. He was not a skilled political operator. He was not immune to poor judgment and friends, but he did believe that the Union victory meant something, that freedom must be enforced, not merely proclaimed. In the end, his presidency was not one of glittering political triumph, it was one of struggle, earnest, imperfect, and determined, during one of the most fragile periods in American history.